All right. I think we are actually here. Those of you that have stuck with us over the 20-minute delay, thank you so much for that. Between John Ortberg, who is a boomer in the best sense of the word, right, John?
Best
And
and worst sense of the word, yeah.
and myself, who is basically a technological boomer masquerading as a millennial. We are not the best pairing for my first ever live stream, but here we are. Welcome to week one of the online book club for the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. This is just 3 weeks long for the 3 parts of the book. Next week, we're going to chat with the Beth Keys, Jefferson Alyssa, and then the week after that with Annie Downs. But week one, we have a living legend, a hero of mine, John Ortberg. John, so nice to see you, even if we're a few minutes late. Thank you for your
It's
time.
wonderful to see you, and we've apparently been ruthlessly eliminating hurry from a lot of people's lives. It's been the first step in the process of practicing the discipline of slowing.
It feels like an appropriate way to start an online book club with a delay as we chat about hurry. Thank you so much for your time. So what's the weather like? First, just let me ask the weather question. Do you know that I grew up in Los Gatos?
I remember you having said that before, but it was not fresh in my mind right now. Today it's sunny and unusually warm, 87 degrees.
Oh, wow, that's really warm. Yeah.
It is
And in
it's
particular,
a hot day. My wife is a person for whom it can never be too hot. So she is thrilled.
okay.
She'll have the butt warmer on in the car in weather like this. So
Yeah,
like
goodness.
favorite. Yeah.
Well, Bay Area weather ruined me. I was there through middle school and have been in the Pacific Northwest ever since, where half of the year it's drop dead gorgeous and unbeatable, and the other half of the year it's very beatable. And today is, I think, maybe our most beautiful day of the year, and it's like it's Bay Area weather. It's like 70s, light breeze, light, jacket, but not too much. Is perfect right now. So I'm loving. I feel like I'm in the Bay Area with you and not
It
in
is
rainy
amazing
Portland.
how just something like light and warmth can make you feel so good, isn't it?
Yeah. After somebody who came from the Midwest and spent many years in Chicago, this just feels like God's reward over your life or something, right?
Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Rockford, Illinois, so I kind of know that drill. But Nancy, my wife, grew up in Southern California, and
Yeah, got it.
used to say she wanted to take people in Chicago by the lapel of their coat, say, you don't have to live here.
That's what I say to my wife about Portland. And she says other things back to me. So anyway, well, thank you for your time. And I just want to honor you, not fanboy, but you have played such a key role in my life, as has Dallas, your mentor, and through your writings into my life. And the time that you've so generously given to me has been such a gift. So thank you for that. Thank you for your time tonight. I can't really think of a better way to kick off a conversation around a book that's all based, that the title of the book, if you're just now starting to read, it's pretty early on, so you most likely are there. But the entire book and the title of the book is based around a line from the philosopher Dallas Willard, that hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day. We have to eliminate it. But it's not from one of his books, of which I've read all of them multiple times, but it's from a conversation the two of you guys had. So I would love just to get a little backstory on that conversation. First off, when was it? Was it late 90s? It was quite a while ago, right?
It would have been in about 1995.
Got it.
We moved from California to Chicago, where I was working at the time at Willow Creek Community Church in 94.
Yeah.
And actually, a friend had talked with me about mentoring, a guy named Max Dupree, who was a wonderful leader and writer, reflected one of the best Christian thinkers about leadership that I know. And he talked about the importance of mentoring and how in our day, because of mobility, it's really hard to find a good mentor.
Yeah.
And recommended, really anybody could do this. Think about somebody in your life or a few people in your life that you would love to learn from, and ask them if they would form kind of a secretariat where you would just arrange to talk with them once a month or so.
Yeah.
And so I did that with Max. Max just passed away a year or two ago, but also asked Dallas if it would be okay if I would call him up once a month and we could just talk about life, ministry, anything. And so it was on one of those phone calls when I was describing to
Okay,
him.
wait, back up, because I want to know more.
Yeah.
So you were in California at Fuller, right? Getting your PhD?
Uh-huh.
And then, because you're from the Midwest originally,
Yes.
California, Fuller, back to Chicago, back to California. So you must have had a relational connection to Willard. Had you done any classes with him, or just met him in passing, or did you just cold call him?
I was at a conference one time, and somebody mentioned uh, uh, a book that Dallas had just written called The Spirit of the Disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
And I had heard of him, but had never read anything by him, never heard a talk by him. And so I picked up a copy of that book and began to read it when I was in the plane flight home to California. And it was one of those moments outside of the Bible. That book has influenced me way more than any other book.
Yeah, same.
And I found I've always been interested in the human condition, faith, God, change. Why is change so difficult? Why are we the way that we are? Those questions to me always felt like they're really the only interesting questions, and all other fields, architecture, chemistry, God bless people that do them, that's fine. But really, these are the questions that matter.
Yeah.
And I went into psychology because I was very interested in the intersection of faith and theology and psychology and spiritual life. But it was very hard to find really good thought on it.
Yeah.
And I finished at Fuller. I went into church pastoral ministry. I found myself somewhat frustrated myself at how difficult it was to change. I knew that I was supposed to read the Bible and pray, and those two activities were often a struggle for me to do. And even when I did them, I did not have clarity that they were causing me to change. It was more like, balancing my checkbook, which you would know nothing about, but back in the old days, there were these things called checkbooks.
No,
and they needed to be what's called
I'm just old enough to remember. I'm not sure I remember balancing one, but no, I remember it.
Yeah, and so it just felt like an obligation, and I'm supposed to do it, but I don't know that it's actually producing change.
Right.
And so I got that book and I read it, and I'll never forget. Just for 4 hours on that plane flight, the chair that I was sitting in on the aisle, and reading through the introduction, when Dallas wrote that the great crisis in the church today is the crisis of a lack of transformation, and that we must take transformation at least as seriously as modern revolutionary movements do.
Wow.
And that his thesis was that authentic transformation really is possible if we are willing to do one thing, and that is to arrange our lives around the practices and rhythms that Jesus engaged in, to be constantly at home with in receiving power from his Father.
Wow.
And when I read that one sentence, I thought, there's somebody who has thought deeply about this, and there is wisdom, and it's possible.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting you say. I didn't know that was your most important book. I would for sure put that as the #1 book in my whole life. I never recommend that people start there with Willard, because it's one of the hardest ones to read. I don't think I even started to understand it until near the end of my second read through. The first read through, I was kind of like, oh yeah, spiritual disciplines are important. And then by the end of the second read through, I started to get his whole secret of the easy yoke and what you just said. Oh, this is how we, and then I think by the third time I was like, oh my gosh, this is so simple, but this is a life-changing paradigm. And we ended up honestly rebuilding, I don't say this a lot, but our entire church is basically built around that book, or the working theory of change in that book,
Wow.
So it's interesting to hear you say that.
There's that old saying that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And for sure, for me, a lot because of my own frustration, having spent so many years studying psychology and theology, and then working at a church, and feeling like I don't think I'm changing, and there's got to be more wisdom out there than what I'm aware of.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why just that thesis sentence that Dallas wrote in that book, it was like a sledgehammer. And so then I was so hungry and so eager. And so the thoughts in that book about that genuine transformation requires training, not just trying, and the role of training or disciplines, not just in spiritual transformation, but in change of any kind.
Yep.
Just immense amounts of wisdom that somehow I made it all the way through, psychology and theology without learning.
Gosh, without
And
learning. That makes
it's
me
not
feel
rocket
better.
science, but
Yeah.
it was like somebody turned on a light in a dark, dark room.
Yeah, it makes me feel better that you have a PhD in psychology and feel the same. I mean, somehow I got through, and this is not at all a critique of my educational institutions I came up through, but somehow I grew up in the church, been reading through the Bible every year since as long as I can remember, went to Bible college, went to seminary, and did not even have, I don't think, a cursory grasp on how human beings actually change, grow, mature, get healing and freedom, and move forward in spiritual formation. And when I came, that I call that book kind of my gateway drug to the whole world of psychology and formation, and experts on the growth of the soul, the healing of the soul, the freedom of the soul. I mean, it just changed everything. And tell me if I want to get back to the mentorship things. I think lots of people have questions about that, but tell me if this reading is accurate or if you think it's bunk. My reading is this, that basically prior to the Enlightenment, the pastor or the priest was, he's called the cure of souls, or the cure, which can mean both care of souls and also cure or healing of souls. And he, most of the time, or she, was an expert in the healing and the growth of the soul. That was a pastor or a priest's job. But in the Enlightenment, in the kind of subdisciplines of academia, as everything began to subdivide and get more and more specialized, and then in the kind of divide between church and state and secular and sacred, somehow in my mind, psychology ended up in the Freudian kind of hyper-secular, anti-Christian kind of world, much of it, and Bible and theology ended up in the realm of the pastor. So now you have psychology, which even the root word there is, psyche, Greek word for soul, soulology, and theology are now like separate categories in a Western person's mind. I mean, I grew up in a fairly conservative church right near you. And I mean, psychology was right up there with like secular music and Satanism. It was just like, therapy was a sign of failure, and so there were lots of great things about what I came up in. I don't even mean that as an easy slam, but it took me a while to get my head around, this is just another way of viewing the soul, which is what Christian spirituality is all about. So critique that, speak into that, add to that.
It's a fascinating subject, and history is another one of those areas where I love to read history. I just enjoy it a lot. I know about enough to be dangerous. So
yeah, same.
There would be huge gaps in my own knowledge there, where it'd be great to have a good historian talking with us. I remember Dallas saying one time, it was actually a bit before the Enlightenment, around Descartes, when actually the understanding of soul shifted.
Yeah.
And that historically, although there were variations around this, the soul was always understood to be the capacity to integrate separate functions into one single whole organism or life.
Right.
And so that's why even with Christian thinkers like Augustine or Aquinas, they would write about the vegetative soul. And that didn't mean that they thought that trees were conscious and going to have active experiences in heaven after they died. They would look at a tree and they would say, it can photosynthesize, it has roots, it can bear fruit, it can reproduce, it has all these different functions. And yet all those functions come together to form one life. And so they called that soul. That was the vegetative psyche soul. And then there was the animal soul, where you add to those powers perception and movement. And then there is the human or rational soul.
Right.
And Dallas said it was around or a little before the Enlightenment, for reasons that would be way above my pay grade, that people started to shift in their thinking of the soul, so that they thought of it as this thin, whispery little thing, like when Daffy Duck gets shot with an arrow and that little translucent Daffy Duck
Right.
rises up into the sky. We
Right.
think of the soul now as the wispy part that lives on after you die. And if you don't know what the soul is, it's hard to care for the soul.
Hmm.
And I do think in earlier times, there was a much clearer understanding of the soul and the parts of the soul that needed to be cared for. And a lot of that is thought to be not scientific in our day. It's very interesting. If you look at translations from the King James up to, say, the Living Bible, the number of times that either ruah or psuke is translated soul just keeps going down. So it's something
Wow.
over 500 times in the King James Bible. I think it's 88 times in the Living Bible. And I think largely that's because we live in a time when even many, many Christians assume that neuroscience or something has demonstrated that the soul does not exist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of why psychology arose. I remember a guy named Richard Lovelace wrote a book years ago on spiritual formation, and he made a real striking statement in it, at least it was striking to me. And he said one of the reasons why depth psychology, Freud in particular, struck such a chord was that the Christian understanding of personhood had kind of flattened out and turned kind of black and white in Victorian morality. So that married people are good, divorced people are bad, scandal respectable, and there was a loss of nuance and layered complexity to the human condition. And that if you look at historically, people like Augustine or John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila, you
Yeah.
find very, very complicated, very layered portrayals of the soul where individuals are capable of enormous mystery and ambiguity.
Right.
But he argued that by the late 19th century, Victorian morality kind of made things more superficial. And so people were starving for language to describe the human condition that captured the confusion and mystery and depth and ambiguity and unknown. And so the language of Freud, although obviously almost every idea of his has been hugely discredited,
Right.
but to be able to talk about the unconscious and the id and projection and all of these ways in which we are strangers to ourselves, people were starved for that language. And so it became very useful and very helpful. But then there was this enormous chasm. So for me, growing up in Rockford, Illinois, in a Swedish Baptist church, to say I'm going to go get a PhD in clinical psychology, very sketchy. That was very suspect.
Now, Jung, who was a disciple of Freud, right? He kind of began to bring them together a little bit more, right? Because he uses so much Christian typology, or no?
Jung did a lot. Jung's father was a pastor, a Swiss pastor. So Jung grew up in an environment where he was very, very familiar with that language. And so, yes, a lot of religious archetypes and what Jung would talk about as the collective unconscious, a lot of the symbols. And so gave Jung a much more religious flavor. Freud, of course, was an ardent atheist and secularist and materialist, and Jung was, considerably more mystical in that way.
Yeah. Okay, so I could ask you about this for days, but coming back, so you're graduating with a degree in clinical psychology, but going into pastoring, and you struggled to put these two worlds together. You read this book by Willard, who's not a psychologist or a theologian, technically. By training, he is quite adept at both, but he's a philosopher. He writes this book, which, it doesn't have the level of psychology of renovation of the heart, that's later, but basically is viewing the human soul through this lens. And you ask him to mentor you, and apparently he says yes. And that begins many years with that. Like, any advice I get young people, I think partially because it's a fatherless and often motherless generation. I get so many people, and I'm in an urban context where there's not a lot of people over a certain age. So many people asking me, how do I get a mentor? Or, and I think there's often unrealistic expectations on a mentor, that the mentor will kind of become a de facto father or mother. Any advice before we get back to your story, just young people looking for a mentor or wanting that, something like that? It doesn't have to be Dallas Willard, but something like that in their life?
Yeah, that is, I think the desire for that is very good. I think to spend considerable amount of time in prayer for it is a really good thing. Um, Another man who was approached quite a lot was a British Anglican preacher who passed away a decade or so ago, John Stott.
Yes.
And one of his mentees was telling me just last week that John Stott asked him why he would come to America, and people would often just pester him to meet with him until they eventually ground him down and he would say yes. And then he said, they might have an hour with me and they would spend 58 minutes of the 60 talking. And they were mostly talking about themselves. So I didn't even need to be there. So,
so don't do that.
Advice is, if you do seek out someone for mentoring, when you're with them, shut up. It's at least for me, you and I have talked about this, John Mark. I'm a 3 on the Enneagram. And so I will always battle the desire to want to impress and to achieve. And I can, as I was younger and I was looking for mentor figures, could often really be wanting somebody who would make me feel important, and just be looking for an important person who would agree to hang out with me so that I could feel more important. And so just being honest with myself, or anybody listening to us, be honest about what are the mixed motives in this for me, and how can I be aware of that? I can't turn those non-noble motives off, but it's good to be self-aware of them, and then be quite wide open and say, I'm not sure where this person would come from or these people would come from. Another thing I would say is, I did not initially ask Dallas to be a mentor. And I would generally say, I wouldn't approach somebody that you don't know out of the blue and ask them to be a mentor.
Right.
Any kind of ongoing relationship has to be sustainable, and it's got to work for both parties. And there's no way you can know that ahead of time. So if you're meeting somebody for the first time, I'd ask to meet with them one time and have thought ahead of time about what would you like to talk about? What questions would you like to ask? If there's somebody who has written or spoken, I would spend some time reading them first. I've actually just asked, there's an Old Testament writer that I want to meet with. He's written some things on the Spirit that I'm very eager to talk to them about. But when I wrote him, I said, I will spend some time reading what you've written first, so that I don't waste your time asking you about things that I could have read about ahead of time.
Right.
So I would pray about it. I would always begin with a single ask. And if there are ways you can learn what that person has communicated before you meet with them, do the homework first.
Yeah, gosh, that's solid advice. Okay, so you do that, you go through that process, you end up in a kind of long-term relationship with Dallas, and then you move back to, did you go straight from Fuller to Willow Creek?
No, I was at several different churches in Southern California first. I was at a church in Simi Valley, California, when I read The Spirit of the Disciplines.
Got it.
And I knew that Dallas taught at University of Southern California, but then it turns out he lived just a couple miles away. I was in Simi Valley. He lived in what's called Box Canyon.
Yeah.
There's a real, he's from rural Missouri, and Box Canyon is the closest thing to rural Missouri you can get in Southern California.
In LA, yeah.
And it was just a few miles away from where I lived in Simi Valley. And so I wrote him a letter and told him how much the book had meant to me, and asked if it would be possible to talk with him. And he wrote back and invited me to come to his house. Wow. It was very moving. I did not know this, but he kept that initial letter, and he died about 25 years later. And after he died, his daughter Becky gave the letter back to me. And again, when he got it, we had never met. And it was very moving. It was also very embarrassing because I did not know this, but I signed it John Ortberg, PhD. Like I needed Dallas Willard to know.
Just give a little
it was John Ortberg, PhD. When he wrote back, he did not write back Dallas Willard, PhD, although of course he was PhD. But what happened then was I went over to his house, and John Market was the most extraordinary thing because I was not prepared for this. You know, he was absolutely brilliant, the smartest guy I ever knew. Just, it's hard to describe the quality of his mind, but his heart was better than his mind. And when we sat there, that was back in the day before cell phones. And a couple of times while we were talking, the phone rang. And when the phone rang in that day, you answered the phone. And I'll never forget, we were talking and he just let the phone ring.
Wow.
And it was like,
he in his, how old was he? 50s, early 50s?
He died in 2013 at the age of 77. So 93, he would have been mid 50s.
Yeah.
55.
Okay, so before you tell us just the story, what was the backstory to that conversation around hurry, like in your own life? I opened my book talking about kind of my experience as that all too common trope of just burning out as a pastor and such, and the busyness of life. What was the background? And don't share anything you don't feel comfortable sharing, but any backstory to that could be helpful for people like myself?
So we had moved from Illinois to Chicago, and I was going from a small church plant in the Diamond Bar area to join the staff of this church, Willow Creek Community Church, where there were literally more people on staff than there were in the congregation of the church that I had served.
Right.
And so it was a very different place, very intense, lots of drive, lots of excitement, lots of pressure, lots of visibility. You know, I was obviously the same person when I got there that I had been the week before, but all of a sudden, just like people thought that I was smarter, people thought that I knew more, just because I was in a different place. And so that was a very sudden, dramatic change of environment. And it was a very different ecosystem. Kind of like all of a sudden you're underwater where the pounds of pressure per square inch is much, much heavier. And so I knew that it was just a lot different. And we had young children. Our kids were 5, 7, and 9 when they moved back there. Nancy was really struggling with moving to the Midwest. And I was not very mature at all in the way that I handled that. I wanted to either fix it so it would go away or make her feel guilty and say, well, we just shouldn't have moved out here, so that then she would feel guilty and stop whining. And I had no idea that it was okay for me to be okay and for her not to be okay, and I could love her and make space for her. So I was struggling with how to navigate that with her. And what I wanted to do in this phone call with Dallas was just simply to describe, here's the way that my life was, here's the way that my life is. What do I need to do to be a healthy, vital, spiritually alive person? So on that call, I just spent considerable time unpacking this. You know how my life was. Now it's here. There's all this stuff going on, all kinds of activity, lots of visibility, lots of pressure, lots of excitement, lots of stuff I love. Nancy's struggling. Here's the demands on me. And that was the question I asked him. What do I need to do to be spiritually vital?
And his answer was, you want to just give us?
There was a long pause with Dallas. There was always a long pause. And then he said one sentence. And I mean, I can hear it like I was listening to it right now, 26 years later. You must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. And that was it. There was another long pause. And then I said, okay, I got that one. What else have you got for me? Because I got a lot going on. I don't have all that much time and I want to get a lot of wisdom. And if any of the folks listening to us have ever heard Dallas or heard talks from Dallas, he was one of the most unhurried people that I know. It was just not in him much at the cellular level. So there was another long pause, and then he just said what you mentioned, John Mark, and everybody can listen to this and see what they think about it. But he said, hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day. And he talked about how there's a difference between being busy and being hurried. Being busy is primarily a condition of the body. It's having many things to do. Jesus was often busy. Being hurried was a condition of the soul. Mm. It was to be so preoccupied, primarily in my mind, that I'm unable to be fully present with God or deeply present to you right now. And that it's just very difficult to live a kingdom kind of life or to love somebody if I'm hurried. And the temptation to chronic hurry addiction, hurry that we're no longer even aware of, hurry that makes it impossible for us to love and keeps us constantly emotionally vulnerable, prone to irritation, lacking in joy. It's just simply the ecosystem. It's the spiritual coronavirus. It's the great enemy.
Wow.
That's what he said.
Yeah, I remember coming across that, living like you in a super secular place and era, kind of no matter where you live, and thinking, hurry? Like, of all the things to name, like there's so many other things that I think if you were to ask me, like, what's the great enemy of spiritual life? I don't know what I would have said, but I doubt hurry would have even come into my imagination, But then the longer I've sat with that, the more I've come to the conviction that, at least in my own story, I mean, just for sure feels so true. Now, when I'm with you, John, and obviously I've known you for tons of time, but every experience I've ever had with you, you have been profoundly unhurried, present as you are right now to me, wise, comfortable in your own skin. How much is that? Like, what were you like before? Is there before and after? I guess I'm asking, is there hope for me? But is really the subtext of the question here. As somebody who's a few years behind you, was there a change in your life overall? Was that already kind of in you and in your personality? Is it something you had to consciously adopt? And if so, what were early steps? Or I'd love to hear you talk about that.
No, I struggle with it much, much more. I think we all have certain kind of wirings, and Dallas also was an academician. He was wired that way. Many philosophers, by temperament and training, think deeply, and so they speak after thinking.
Yeah.
And so I think with Dallas, it was largely a result of being drawn into the kingdom and much training, much solitude. But he's probably also more unhurried by nature. My dad just passed away this last year. My dad was a classic type B. I can remember we would go play tennis. When I was a kid growing up, we had an indoor tennis club in Rockford. I played a lot of tennis. I would go with my dad, and he'd love to talk about tennis. And so we'd be on a road where the speed limit was 65 and he'd be going 35. And he just killed me. I was like, Dad, hit the accelerator, man. So No, uh, I will tend to be, I'll tend to walk fast, tend to talk fast. Um, so it's taken a lot more training for me. And you know, that statement from Dallas, I will have thought about literally thousands and thousands of times. And uh, part of what I learned from Dallas is the importance of things like solitude. And for the longest time, I struggled with solitude because I thought it was about what you're supposed to do in solitude.
Mm.
And that I should be preparing for it well, and I should be having these profound thoughts in it. And it took a long time to experience. You know, Dallas would divide spiritual practices or disciplines up into disciplines of abstinence, where you don't do things you normally do, and then disciplines of engagement, where you do things that you don't normally do. And solitude is a discipline of abstinence. It's not about what you do. You could use it to pray or to study, but solitude is about not doing what you normally do and then seeing what happens.
Yeah.
So as long as you're alone and you're not getting outside stimulation, you can't flunk it. And
Yeah.
part of what happens in solitude is you can't rush solitude.
Yeah.
And so that was a helpful practice for me.
I just finished 3 days in solitude. Kind of a long story, and I was sitting outside, and just through serendipity, I had a letter, like actual on paper letter from a Jesuit priest and spiritual director that I've spent quite a bit of time with, and has been a gift into my life. And he had this beautiful line. He said, "In solitude, you get to, quote, experience the inner life of the Trinity, the profound stillness of perfect awareness that boils with life."
Wow.
And I was sitting outside, and it was really quiet, but yet there were all these trees and birds around me. And it's like, you know how a forest is like really quiet and really noisy at the same time?
Yes.
And I just thought that must be what the inner life of the Trinity is like, really quiet and really noisy at the same time. But like the sound of a forest, you know what I mean? Just boiling with life. But you get invited into that, but it's a very different kind of experience of.
Now, when you think about a forest, there's lots of activity and lots of noise, and it all quiets the soul.
Yeah.
And human-made noise almost never quiets the soul.
Yeah.
Music, but mostly it doesn't. Machines, not so much. But I think you're right. And that thought that in solitude, we are actually tasting the inner experience of the Trinity. What a great thought.
Isn't that a nice thought? Yeah.
I will carry that away from this. That's fabulous.
Yeah. All right. So I want to respect your time. So I just want to ask you one question. And those of you who are online, I'll answer questions for a bit. So maybe just start typing any questions you have into the comments, and I'm happy to fire off whatever comes to mind. But John, just one question I'd love to ask you. About 7 years ago, 8 years ago now, maybe 9 years ago now, is when I kind of had an early midlife crisis, burnout, existential. And it was more than just like an emotional crisis. It was really an existential crisis. Same thing as you. I'm not changing. I've been following Jesus for a long time. And for many years, I felt this kind of growth and movement forward. And then once my discipleship to Jesus just hit kind of those deeply ingrained habits of sin that are in me at a cellular level, passed down from my great grandfather, stuff in my family line and in my family of origin and in my personality and in my attachments and my addictions. It's like all of the sudden, the kind of go to church, read your Bible, pray, do it. It was like banging my head against a concrete wall, So a very kind of existential crisis, not so much a crisis of faith, but a crisis of like spiritual formation. Like why does this not work? And are we preaching something, that isn't true? Or, what am I missing here? And so when I came in through Spirit of the Disciplines, through Willard's book, into the world of formation and then psychology and like all of the stuff, And so many, I mean, I could just talk for hours about how many life-changing, paradigm-breaking practices, experiences, ideas, inner healing, encounter with God. But by far the hardest of everything has not been Enneagram or family of origin or rule of life or shadow side or therapy. The hardest, forgiveness, the hardest of all of it has been hurry. Like that has been the hardest, where I feel, on one hand, I feel like I'm way better than I used to be. On the other hand, I feel like I am nowhere even close to the image I have or the ideal in my mind's eye. And so that's my own psychosis. But I guess the question for you is, you know, as a 60 something, you've lived in a pre-iPhone and post-iPhone world. You've been on staff at major churches. You're right now the lead pastor, senior pastor, whatever the official title of is, of a giant church in the Bay Area, multiple locations. And yet you found a way inside that rubric to not, you've not left it all and gone out to a monastery or, you know, abandoned your family. You're right in the middle of bustling life. You've found a way to live an unhurried, healthy, vital spirituality, as you said. But, you know, the real question for me is like, how in particular do I do this with the phone? Like I've even noticed with COVID-19, I'm on my phone way more than I was before. And I normally have a digital rule of life. It's very hard to stick to, but I have one and I attempt to do these things and practices. But with the shutdown, it's like my whole life now is over Zoom or on my phone or, you know, trying to pastor people over the internet. So I do as much as I can through my laptop. But all that to say, I've noticed in the last 2 months a profound uptick in my inner pace. Like it's just, the phone is so fast, and I think it trains the brain to expect the world at 4G speed, and then to expect my children or my wife or the person I'm talking to then operate at that same pace. And shocker, they don't. And then I become agitated or on edge or anxious. So I'm really seeing what it's doing to my own heart. So I guess the honest question is, can you live an unhurried life with a phone? And what is your experience of pursuing an unhurried life kind of pre-iPhone and post, you know, pre-digital age? When you had that conversation, it was in the 90s, email was just kind of hitting the circuit. Now we're at a whole other moment, which is great stuff. I can chat to you from another state that I can't even drive to, much less fly to. But there's stuff there. So any thoughts there on, you must ruthlessly eliminate technology for your life as the next John Ortberg book, or what do we do?
I do have thoughts, although mostly they'll just be invitation, challenge, encourage to you and everybody who's listening to us. I remember reading a book about Ignatius and Ignatius' gifts to the world and leadership. And one of the points the writer made was, in Benedict's day, the world was very immobile. And so building a way of life around a rooted community where you don't go anywhere, and observing the offices, stopping for prayer 7 times a day, arranging your life around that worked. It made sense. By Ignatius' time, he had a mission around the world. He wanted to send priests out, and they had to be mobile. They had to be willing to travel, go by boat, go on foot. There were roads.
It's an apostolic kind of spirituality. Not monastic.
And that's part of where the spiritual exercises of Ignatius were to be done in 40 days. And the idea of pausing 7 times a day for prayer for Ignatius was a non-starter. He said, anybody who can't be fully surrendered to God with 15 minutes of prayer has not yet been mortified. So he lived in a different world and therefore had to find a different way. And I think one of the temptations for us is we can want to pursue what folks like Dallas have taught us, that we need a transforming way of life. It's not just Bible study and prayer. It's not, doesn't have to be confusing. It's not rocket science. We know it will involve self-examination, will involve confession, will involve surrender, will involve serving, will involve generosity. You know, we know these things, but it has to be put together in an organic way through which we receive power in our particular context. And most of the folks listening to us now live in a context of technology that I just didn't growing up. And honestly, for better and for worse, I still don't. So I do have an iPhone. I think this is an iPhone 7. It's like prehistoric. I have a Facebook account, but I don't know much about how to access it. My son-in-law, Zach, who works for an outfit called Slack and is wonderful around all of this stuff. He says that he is a digital native and I will always be an immigrant.
Yeah.
And now the bad side of that is I'm not going to be able to leverage it. I'm not going to be able to grow from it. I'm not going to be able to use it like a native. On the other hand, I think if I was a native in it, if it was part of the rhythms of my life, it would throw up a lot more challenges around things like stillness. And so what I'd say for anybody listening to us is you're now living in a different day than I lived in or even live in, and you will have to find a way. I know people like Andy Crouch. You may have read Andy's book, The Tech-Wise Family.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's a wonderful book. John Mark, I thought what you wrote was so good. Realizing, as I read about in your book, how much sleep people used to get.
Yeah. Gosh.
And how, I would feel guilty when I would read John Wesley got up at 4 a.m. to pray for a couple hours, but he went to bed at 7 at night. He had nothing better to do.
And didn't live with his wife for 10 years,
Yeah,
so he had no family to take care of and went to bed at 7. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and that's where the point that you were talking about before, the power of hurry, I think gets to a real profound point. I asked Dallas one time, one of his books is called The Divine Conspiracy. And I asked him about the title. Did it have to be a conspiracy? And he said, yes, by the nature of reality, it had to be a conspiracy because if God came in obvious power, there would be no freedom left.
Wow.
So he has to come through the cracks in hidden ways. And evil works the same way. There's kind of a mirror dynamic where for evil to do its worst work, it can't look like Darth Vader.
Yeah.
It can't look harmful. And I think that's often a feature of fairy tales. Someone takes the blue pill instead of the red pill. Someone goes into the wardrobe. You never know in a fairy tale that you've done the thing that's going to produce your doom or your salvation. And it seems unfair, but the reality is that's what happens in life. How does somebody become an addict? How does somebody end up going down a road where they're going to destroy their family or destroy their character? If they knew it, they wouldn't do it. And hurry is that way. And so something wonderful like technology, which God can use in such great way. I'll think sometimes even that word, technology, logos, the word, in the beginning was the word, and then technos, Jesus was a technon, a carpenter, a mason. You can't say technology without saying his name twice.
Wow.
He's all over it, but precisely because it can be so good when it's good, it can do great harm to us. And but it doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like violence or adultery, or it looks so banal. It looks so superficial, but it's just as good at choking the soul.
Wow. John, that was incredibly profound. I think that I'm going to go back and re-listen to this conversation because it's me asking you questions. But that for sure, I think I will sit with. Thank you so much for that. I want to respect your time and also want to honor you. So for any of you watching or listening, if you don't know John Ortberg, first off, now you know. John, where can people find you? You're the pastor of Menlo Park Church or Menlo Church in Menlo Park, California. How many books have you written now? I'm trying to read all of yours. I still have a couple of left. I'm really excited. My next read by you is Who Is This Man, which I hear is amazing.
Oh,
so,
I loved writing that book.
Yeah. What's your favorite book of yours, by the way?
You know,
you have one?
It's so much like What's Your Favorite Child?
Yeah.
It's hard to say in it varies, but I wrote a book called Soul Keeping, and
Yes.
a lot of it was about Dallas and our relationship together. So there are ways in which that one is real special to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one of my favorites by you. I love your most recent one on Eternity is Now in Session. We're going to use that. We're doing a series in practice later this year, God willing, on preaching the gospel and what is the gospel. So we'll lean heavy on that and invite our church to read that. But so much of your work, just how many books total now have you written?
I think 12. I'm getting old enough and there's enough of them. I'm not sure exactly, but
yeah.
I think 12. Yeah.
Well, there's a couple still left to read on my list, but everyone I've read, Soul Keeping, I think I've read 4 or 5 times, has just been wonderful. Jude's, my son, is right now reading Eternities Now in Session. So he's not very far in, so hopefully you don't lose him, but he's loving it so far.
Well, tell him hi for me. He's a dear soul.
Yes, I will. He'll be happy to hear that. Thank you for your time. Honor you. And for any of you listening, I cannot encourage you to pick up John's work, read his books, follow his podcast, follow his work any more than I can. So thank you for your time. Have a great night. I'm going to answer a few questions. I'm going to stay on. You're welcome to stay on, but you're off the hook.
Sure. I'd love to stay on if that would be good.
Oh, that'd be amazing. I'm just trying to respect your time. All right. So it doesn't look like there's a ton of questions here. Let me see. Okay. Facebook. This is the first time
I can stay until
Facebook
7 o'clock if that's useful.
In 8 years. It took me a while to even log on. So I'm trying to figure out how to scroll here. But how do you practically balance time for solitude and retreat with being present with your family? Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I don't know about you, John, but your wife's extroverted, right?
She has never had an unexpressed thought or feeling.
Mine is too. So introvert, extrovert. We have 3 kids as well, obviously much younger than yours now. So it's been a long running conversation. I think we both had to learn to make space for each other. She had to learn to make space. The question was not about introversion, it was about solitude. So I want to be careful to not conflate those 2 things together. But I think for us, it was just an inner dialogue between both of us have different needs as far as like amount of solitude. And that's my take, because I think everybody needs time in solitude and stillness. Some of us, if you're an introverted kind of teacher, you're probably going to need a lot more than if you're an extroverted, doing something else, but all of us need time. So I think for us, it's just been about balancing and giving time to each other. And especially when the kids are young, kind of watching the kids trade it off. Any advice you have there, John?
Very similar story with Nancy. Our biggest conflict in the early years was very much around division of labor. And although I talked a good game about servanthood and egalitarian marriage, I talked it much better than I lived it. And so that would have been the biggest sore point. The only other thing is, I think if this person is on staff at a church, most churches would be happy for their spiritual leader to be taking time away in solitude. And it would be possible to talk with supervisors or elders about, could I take part of my time and devote it to being alone with God? And you might be able to do that in a way where you wouldn't be taking it away from the family.
Great. So well done. Here's a question. What presence does the Holy Spirit play in the ruthless elimination of hurry? I mean, my take on that, John, is that the practices or the spiritual disciplines by which we, at a very practical level, slow ourselves down, whether that's silence and solitude or Sabbath or whatever, are conduits for the Spirit. They are like the way that we open up our mind and our body to, I love Gordon Fee, Pentecostal scholar, his definition of the Spirit as God's empowering presence. The way, and he does quite a detailed theological exploration of God's empowering presence. It's divine, it's power, it's presence. And that's how we open ourselves up to the Holy Spirit to do that work of deep inner transformation that we can't do through reading a great book or having a great coach or trying really hard, that only God can do at some level in us. I think that's how I would answer it. What about you? It says John. I'm not sure if they're talking to me or to you.
Yeah. I'm John Carl, actually, so they could use the middle name to specify. Can I tell you a real quick little like taxonomy that Dallas laid out one time about spirit?
Yeah. Oh, you can do whatever you want. You're the star of the show, John.
When the book Spirituality for Dummies came out, Dallas wrote a little article called Spirituality for Smarties. And part of his point was, in our day, we don't think of spirituality to be an arena in which knowledge is possible. We do for chemistry or math or history, but not spirituality. And so he said, actually, you could think about spirit in different ways. If, historically, spirit has always been thought of as a form of energy, breath, wind, spirit. And so you could think of it as being either personal or impersonal. And you could think of it as being either immanent or transcendent. So if it's impersonal, then it's a force that I could leverage the way that I do electricity or gravity for my own purposes. So New Age spirituality might be a bit like this, where there is a spiritual force, but I try to use it through crystals or whatever to obtain wealth.
Energy, yep.
If it's personal rather than impersonal, then I'm dealing with a person who has a mind and a will. And so I can't simply use it. If it's an impersonal force, I can use it. If it's a person, I must relate to him or her. And then it's either immanent, the God within, Shirley MacLaine, or transcendent. There is a spirit, a God over and above me, to whom I am accountable. And so that thought of wanting to relate to the Holy Spirit does mean it's not a magic force. I will have to relate to the Spirit as a person, and I meet the Spirit in solitude in some unique ways. And that description that you gave of solitude is the place where you enter into the inner life of the Trinity. Dallas used to say, you discover some things in solitude that you don't discover otherwise. One of them is other people are usually not as bad as you thought. And another one is
that's true.
You discover that you have a soul. One of the worst parts about hurry is it causes you to not be aware that you have a soul. And part of why we often get uncomfortable with solitude is we can't get away from our soul. And then in solitude, because the Spirit of God meets with our spirit, bears witness with our spirit, I am meeting with the Spirit in unique ways in solitude. So it's a wonderful question.
Gosh, that's so good. John, there's a number of questions here about how hard solitude is for extroverts, which is one of the main questions I get. And one of the easiest ways for people to write me off, as a unabashed introvert. I mean, any pastoral advice for that very common problem?
Yeah, I remember, somebody saying, solitude wouldn't be so bad if I could bring some of my friends along and music and books. And so, what I'd say on that is twofold. One is don't try to be heroic with it. I'm an introvert. It's much easier for me to spend long stretches of time in solitude. It doesn't mean I'm particularly spiritual. Nancy loves people naturally way better than I do. She remembers their names. She remembers their lives. She expresses care for them. And love is the measure of spiritual maturity, not solitude. So don't gauge your spirituality by how easy or difficult solitude is.
So well said. It's a means to an end. Yeah, it's utilitarian. The end is love.
And don't try to force yourself to do it, but then recognize the goal of solitude is not to get good at solitude. In solitude, if you go into solitude, you'll just learn things. In solitude, I find out what is my mind full of? What do I think about? What am I anxious about? What am I afraid of? What makes me restless? And freedom comes. In solitude, other people are not cheering for me or booing me, and I get a little freed of that.
Yeah.
And now those things like that freedom and that realization that you are not what other people think, that will get into your body in solitude. And whether you think you did it well or had a profound mystical experience with God or learned something real deep to do or didn't is not the point of solitude. That's not the point. If you just simply go away and withdraw from people and stimulation, that is the point. And that will do good and bring freedom in your life. It just will. It will validate itself.
Wow. There's a question here from Catherine. When does solitude become a selfish endeavor? As an introverted mom, I feel like I'm constantly seeking solitude. First off, Catherine, props to you. I feel your pain. I mean, I've felt, I wonder if there's not, like, the Spirit is always leading us to the growth edge in our personality. So I think for many extroverts, you know, that take spiritual formation and just Jesus seriously, I'm constantly hearing how the Spirit is moving them into the quiet. And I know in my own experience, the Spirit is constantly moving me out of the quiet, you know? And solitude it's not a destination. It's in a sense, you know, it's a stopping point on the journey of love, it seems like. And so I know that the Spirit is always moving me out of solitude into concrete, normally very non-heroic, practical acts of love. I love to end my morning quiet time, because I practice a little solitude every morning, with just the very simple question of, God, what would please you today? And then I just see what comes to mind. And I don't know for sure if what comes to mind is from the Spirit, but almost always it is a very small, very easy to do, very practical act of love. That's almost always what comes into my mind. And I have to often like move. Some people, you know, you're a high P on the Myers-Briggs, or more spontaneous by nature. I'm very structured, very high J. So the Spirit is always opening me up to interruption. I just was having a conversation with my therapist the other day about struggling and COVID and being all locked up in the house with the kids and not being alone for 8 weeks straight, which is an introvert's idea of hell, you know? And I'll try to get up early, you know, to beat all the kids up so I can have a quiet solitude time. But then if the kids, you know, one morning, my son, you know, Jude, who's 14, normally is like teenager, sleeps in, can't get him out of bed to do school, got up at 5:50, right? And was made himself tea, had his Bible open, was getting ready to do a spin class on our bicycle or whatever, and was gonna get his school started early that day and knock it out so he could go on a long hike that afternoon in the forest. And I just thought, this is like every parent's dream. And I was so annoyed. I was like, I was in the foulest mood as my son is doing what every parent of a teenager is dreaming. I was just, I can't say the word I was so mad. Like, you ruined my solitude. You ruined my quiet. Now the whole day's ruined, you know? Yeah. And I was processing this with my therapist, and he said, but when those interruptions come, maybe that is your prayer. If the whole point of prayer is more and more just the space that we give to God to transform us into people of love, then an interruption can function just as well as a perfect, serene. And then he said, you're still pursuing the fantasy of a quiet life. And I said, heck yeah, I am. Oh, good. So Catherine, I feel for you. But I do think we have to create time, whatever our personality or stage of life is. But for some of us for whom solitude can be selfishness, which it very much can for me, I just think follow the Spirit's promptings out. And just what you're saying, that how long we spend in solitude and how we feel it goes is not the measure of success or failure. It's how does Jesus become real in our life and through us to other people, you know?
I can't imagine a better answer than that. I need to pull off now. Thank you so much for being able to do this. I feel like I learn every time I get to talk with you. So great joy. Many
It's such a
blessings on everybody
joy.
listening.
Same to you and all of you watching. I'm going to cut it off just because we're an hour and a half in now, which is half an hour longer than I had planned. But save all your questions. We'll be back here next Thursday night, hopefully on time, 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Hopefully we have the tech stuff figured out now, ready to go with Jefferson and Alyssa Bethke. Read part 2 if you can before next week. Don't stress it. Don't hurry, but it's really short. Read that if you can before next week. We'll chat about all that stuff. John, thank you for your time. Honor you. Bless you. Can't wait until airplanes are a thing again, and I can hopefully buy you lunch.
Me too. Wonderful. Thanks, John Mark.
Yep. See ya.
Okay.